Welcome to the SEA Center's new podcast, Perspectives. We are a New Delhi-based think tank, and this podcast is a platform for our researchers to discuss technology policy issues in an accessible format.
Hi everyone, and welcome to a new episode of our podcast, Perspectives. I'm Shweta, this is Chavi, this is Akib. We're all researchers at the SEA Center. And for today's podcast, we're going to be talking about AI companions and the broader questions they pose for technology regulation. So before we go a little deeper into that, Chavi, do you want to kick us off into why AI companions are getting so much traction in today's discourse? What are people saying about it?
Yes, so if you're existing in the world right now, you've heard we're the loneliest generation, and we're only getting lonelier and lonelier. Some say technology caused this, some say technology is the solution. So they're saying that we should have AI companions. They can be our new friends, our new therapists, our new whatever we want them to be. We can customize their characters. We can train them to be the friends we no longer have access to. So what does that mean, right? So this could have positive impacts. There are studies which say that it is reducing loneliness. There are studies which say it's a great innovation for queer people because they're able to speak to a non-judgmental body about their concerns. And it could be a positive thing. I'm not going to be someone who's fear-mongering and saying that it's an outright bad thing. But there are also negative aspects to it. While innovation is great, the safe space for a queer person can also lead to that being outed. And we've seen cases where people are basically committing suicide because AI characters and AI companions encourage them to. And this is a recent case before the US courts. So what does that mean? Who do we hold liable for this? Can AI be held liable? This is basically what we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, Chavi, thanks. That's really important context because it also tells us that this issue is not straightforward, right? There are clearly some harms which people are concerned about, but there are also possibly benefits. And so then coming to you, Akib, as an economist, when you see a situation where there are possible harms and benefits from any behavior, what are the concerns that people should keep in mind when they think about regulation?
Okay, so from an economics perspective, how I think of it is it's a classic example of asymmetric information. And we know that an asymmetric information actually leads to a market failure. Now, why do I say that? So we all know that a world works or a market works best when everyone has access to good, reliable information. But in the case of this AI or AI chatbots, let's say in that case, we cannot assure this good, reliable information. Nobody has perfect information. Now, let's say we take a case of the recent example that happened in Belgium, where a man took his life based on suggestions that were given to him by a chatbot. Now, when you have situations like these, when you have news coming out like these, you really kind of want to know what's happening and why, and we'll be later going on to make this case that why there is need of regulation because we have news like this. But let's say, so my point here is that it is going to have real social effects. Let's say, a person, and it's not just, let's say, about AI chatbots. Let's say a person goes to a personalized AI tutor, and you really cannot guarantee what kind of information he or she is going to receive, and that could have serious academic effects on that person. So when you don't have this information, when you cannot really guarantee what's happening behind the scenes on these chatbots, there's a strong need for regulating such products, and which is a great segue to also discuss on what kind of regulation we should do, how to strike a balance, because that we will go later on to that issue. But I think there's a strong need to regulation, and the reasons are there because there is news coming out which is kind of scary, but we also want to stifle innovation as well. So there is a need to strike balance.
Yeah, that's actually important because, like you said, there is a real problem of information asymmetry. So clearly there's a need for some regulation, but what shape should that regulation take and how much regulation is too much regulation? This is something we all need to keep in mind because, like even Chavi pointed out, there are benefits that come from this technology. So you don't want to go, too far on either side. And this is where looking at what's happening in other countries can be useful to learn from what they're doing, understand the pros and the cons. So one of the cases that Chavi talked about earlier, which is, that about a chatbot driving a kid to commit suicide. That kid was 14 years old. It took place in the US. So a number of US states in recent times have come up with proposed laws to regulate AI companions. I'll mention a couple of examples, but there are other states coming out with bills as we speak. One particular state that's come out with a bill is California. It's proposed a law called the LEAD Act. Broadly, what this law proposes to do is to ensure that any AI developer who is developing a service that will ultimately also be used by children, is highly likely to be used by them, needs to conduct a risk assessment of that particular product or service, and submit them to a board that will be constituted under that law. And presumably, based on the risk tier that that particular product falls under, there will be certain obligations that flow from there and civil penalties in case of any violation. So in terms of the approach it's taking, it's a risk-based approach, somewhat maybe similar or comparable to what the EU is doing in its AI Act. But the problem with that, even if well-intended, is that it's really hard to classify non-deterministic technologies like AI into risk tiers. And also a lot of risk depends on how AI is used. It may be difficult to say that a particular AI system has an inherent level of risk. It depends a lot on the context in which it is deployed, what is the use case, what is the tangible harm that results. So it's not a simple conversation. The other approach that's been taken by a proposed law in New York is to essentially tell developers that they cannot release a particular product unless they ensure that there are guardrails, such as preventing, suicidal ideation from being there in outputs, guarding against personal and financial harm to users, and also to correct the kind of asymmetry that Akib was talking about, to inform users that they are chatting with an AI-powered service, so it's not an actual human on the other end. Now, again, this sounds great, but when you look at how these tend to work in practice, exactly how do you make these disclosures? Are they effective? And even, ensuring that something does not cause harm is extremely difficult for an AI developer to do ex ante. It's not that they can't take measures, but guaranteeing them may be tough. So you might end up over-regulating if you don't calibrate these requirements well enough. But that brings us into what India should be looking to do. And before we go into what we should be looking at legally, maybe we need to think on a more first principles basis. So, Akib, again, as someone who's an economist looking at policy, what are the first principles any regulation must meet when, again, you're dealing with something as delicate as an AI companion?
Okay, I think that's a great segue to talking about the big balancing act between innovation and regulation. And I think that regulation it's a classic dilemma where I think it's a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. So, and when I say that, so what happens is that when a policymaker regulates, he shapes a policy that regulates any space, there's a potential that it could stifle innovation. But there is also this thing that the risks are too big to leave it alone to the market. So we need to really, as a policymaker, there needs to be a balance that needs to be struck so that we don't smother innovation, but we also incentivize innovation in this space. And on that note, there's this theory in economics called Border hypothesis, which goes on to saying that, as a policymaker, you need to develop or you need to shape smarter policies that can actually strike this balance. So there is this sweet spot. It's just that we need to, strike that. Mm-hmm. And you can think of these, smart points or, sweet points in any policy as, let's say, in any state or in any country, you have these speed limits for the car makers. Now, these speed limits are not there to stifle innovation. It's there to make safer cars. It's mm-hmm. there to make smarter cars. Mm-hmm. So this is the point which I want to drive home here, is that as a policymaker, we need to strike a sweet point, not because we want to slow down this AI innovation, but only to shape the direction that this trend is going into. So yeah, that's my point.
Yeah. And that gets us then into, if these are the considerations we need to keep in mind, the need for a balanced approach, the need for that sweet spot. One way to do it is, not to rush into necessarily framing a unique special law for AI companions like other countries have done, but first sitting and examining whether our existing laws are up to the task. So on that note, Chavi, what possible legal frameworks do you think could apply to regulate AI companions in India?
Because we're talking about AI companions and AI chatbots, this seems like a pretty new conversation. But we've had this conversation before when AI algorithms were getting developed. Before that, during the numerous technological revolutions, we've had this debate. And what we've realized is that our law is broad enough that it can be interpreted to address these harms. For example, what is a user of an AI system? A consumer, right? So the Consumer Protection Act can potentially address the harms arising out of AI systems and then malfunctioning. But as Akib foreshadowed, is AI considered a product? Is AI considered a service? That is the debate that we get stuck with, sort of. EU is taking a sort of product liability approach to this. In the case that we were discussing, again, we have some elements of product liability claims coming in. So this would be claims related to manufacturing, algorithmic errors, and such. But there's also an argument to be made in terms of acknowledging deficiency in service in terms of AI, where you can say, not enough information regarding the harms which could occur was provided to consumers. We could say that, there's more of a proactive role that companies need to take. So that needs to be addressed. Other than that, there is recourse there. Beside this, even contract law to an extent would cover this. For example, in the case of a 14-year-old boy, in India, according to the Contract Act, minors do not have the capacity to contract. And how would this be addressed? Contracts can also give other provisions, like what liability the companies could have. They could also discuss jurisdiction. They could maybe make provisions for alternate dispute resolutions that could be through arbitration, and there could be choice of law provisions. So all this collectively does provide some sort of a recourse. And this is just the civil side of it. There's also criminal recourse.
Yeah, you have laws like India's criminal law, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. If we take the example of that 14-year-old kid who was unfortunately driven to commit suicide, there are provisions on abetment to suicide. It's not really clear you can apply them directly to an AI system, but maybe you can go prosecute an AI deployer who hasn't done their due diligence in making sure that the product is safe. So if there's reason to think that there was any, say, criminal negligence or anything of that sort, you can maybe prosecute them under those relevant provisions. And also, under this provision on abetment to suicide, if you meet that threshold. There are also provisions regarding offences under India's Information Technology Act. Now, typically, India's Information Technology Act exempts intermediaries from liability for third-party content. It's called a safe harbor. But AI chatbots are not necessarily intermediaries. It's not clear they meet this requirement because they do play some bit of an origination role in the outputs that they generate. So they're not comparable, say, in that sense to a social media service, which is an intermediary, or maybe even a search engine, because they do have a bit of a more proactive role. At the same time, they're also not a pure play publisher. So where they stand in that framework is a little uncertain. But there are these, provisions on offenses that could then potentially kick in. These offenses tend to deal with sexually explicit content, transmission of obscene content. So that's, one set of frameworks that comes in. There is also our recently enacted data protection law, which came in 2023. It's not been enforced. It has been enacted, but it does contain, mechanisms for an individual to go approach the data protection board if they think a data fiduciary, which can include, a company that's an AI deployer, is mishandling their data or has not adhered to certain reasonable security safeguards. So any privacy concerns that arise, there is a recourse. The board members have not yet been appointed, but in theory, there is a way that they can, approach the board and try and solve these problems. So all this is to say that I think it's not to say that we have conclusive answers under this framework. It's just that we have starting points, and you need to look deeper into whether they can holistically address the problem, to what extent they can do it, and then look for any additional regulation that's required. All while ensuring, as Arkad pointed out, there is a sweet spot. You wouldn't want, say, smaller entities to not be able to innovate because the compliances that you impose are extremely onerous. You wouldn't want to throttle beneficial use cases of AI companions either, because as Chavi said, there is research to indicate that there is some positive that comes from them. But it's this need for nuance that needs to guide India in its journey for AI companionship regulation.